The navigational array aboard the Sovereign Reach died at 03:17 local time, and Navigator First Class Yeveth Sonadrel felt the ship go blind the way a living creature feels a severed nerve, a sudden absence where certainty had been, replaced by nothing. 14 hours. That was the number on the emergency power reserve when the Cascade failure finished eating its way through the Reach's primary systems. 14 hours of breathable atmosphere, diminishing heat, and whatever the backup batteries could sustain before the Velthari heavy cruiser became a sealed tomb drifting through the Kesrin Shoals, a navigational dead zone, so thoroughly mapped as impassable that the Velthari Admiralty had printed it on their charts in funeral gray, the color reserved for places where ships went and did not return. Yeveth's hands were still on the navigation console. The console was dark. Every console on the bridge was dark except for the emergency status board, which glowed the dim amber of a system running on its last reserves, and the countdown clock, which someone in the engineering section had patched to the bridge repeater so that everyone could watch the number fall. 14:00:00. 13 other officers sat at their stations in the emergency lighting, and not one of them looked at Yeveth, because what had happened was not her fault and they knew it, and because looking at the navigator when the ship could not navigate felt like an accusation no one intended to deliver. "Report," said Commander Toreth Vinakaris from the command chair. His voice carried the particular steadiness of a man who had decided that if the ship was going to die, it would die with proper procedure observed. He was Velthari career military, 41 years in the Admiralty's Deep Patrol Service, and he had the kind of face that did not move when the news was bad. "Total navigational failure," Yeveth said, and her own voice surprised her with its calm. "Primary array is destroyed. Backup array is offline. The Cascade took the coupling relays. I have no stellar fix, no subspace positioning, and no inertial reference. I can tell you we are inside the Kesrin Shoals. I cannot tell you where inside the shoals we are or which direction leads out." "Can you rebuild the backup array?" "Not without components we don't carry. The coupling relays are a specialized unit. We have spares for everything around them but not for them." Commander Vinakaris absorbed this the way he absorbed all information, with a single, slow blink that might have been acknowledgement or might have been the only concession to despair that his training permitted. "Communications. Operational on emergency power," reported Signals Officer Deneth from the communication station. "But the shoals degrade subspace transmissions. Effective range is approximately 11 light minutes. There is nothing within 11 light minutes of us. The nearest charted shipping lane is 4 light towers Coreward." "Engineering." Chief Engineer Alves's voice came through the internal comm, tinged with the static of failing relays. "The Cascade burned through junction nodes 7 through 14. We have maneuvering thrusters, emergency life support, and the backup batteries. Main drive is offline. I can bring it back, but it will take 6 hours, and I need the navigation array talking to the drive controls before I can fire it safely. Without navigation data, a blind engine burn in the shoals could push us straight into a gravity pocket." 13:47:22. Yeveth pulled up the last navigational snapshot the array had captured before dying a frozen image of the gravitational terrain surrounding the Sovereign Reach. The Kesrin Shoals were not a nebula or an asteroid field. They were a region of gravitationally distorted space, where the remnants of a stellar collision 3 million years ago had left pockets of compressed gravity and stretched spacetime that played havoc with navigational systems, communications, and the sanity of anyone trying to fly through them on instruments. The Velthari Admiralty used the shoals as a shortcut between the Kesrin sector and the Outer Veil administrative zones, a shortcut that saved 11 days of conventional transit, and killed approximately 1 ship every 4 years when something went wrong that the navigational array could not compensate for. Something had gone wrong. A gravity pocket that was not on the charts or that had migrated since the last survey, which happened in the shoals, had caught the Sovereign Reach in a tidal gradient steep enough to stress the hull and fry every navigational sensor on the port array. The Cascade had done the rest. Now they were blind, drifting and running out of air. Options, Commander Vinokaris said. We can attempt to navigate by visual stellar observation, Yeveth offered. Manual celestial fixes through the optical ports. It would take me approximately 6 hours to establish a reliable position, assuming I can identify enough reference stars through the gravitational distortion. That leaves 8 hours to plot a course out and execute it on maneuvering thrusters. And if the distortion is too heavy for visual fixes, then I cannot establish our position, and we drift until the reserve expires. 1333-41. Yeveth did not wait for the commander's order. She pulled the manual star chart archive from the navigation station's hard-copy drawer actual printed charts, because the Velthari Admiralty had never abandoned physical backups for exactly this situation, and began setting up the optical observation equipment that was bolted to the bridge's upper viewport. It was old equipment, pre-automation, the kind of thing navigators trained on in their first year at the academy and never expected to use in service. She had been a navigator for 9 years. She had plotted courses through 3 combat zones, 2 diplomatic convoys, and the annual Admiralty Fleet Review, which was honestly more stressful than the combat zones, because the admiral of the fleet liked to change the formation pattern mid-review and expected his navigators to compensate without being told. She had never navigated blind by hand in a gravity field that bent starlight like water bending a submerged stick. But she was Velthari. The Velthari did not stop working the problem until the problem killed them or they killed it. Those were the only 2 outcomes the Academy recognized. The optical scope was cold to the touch. The bridge temperature had already dropped 2 degrees since the Cascade. She calibrated it against the viewport frame, checked the alignment, and began her first stellar observation. 130809. The first attempt took 40 minutes and gave her nothing useful. The gravitational distortion was worse than she had estimated. Stars that should have occupied fixed positions in the Kesren reference catalog were displaced by as much as 3 degrees, which, in celestial navigation, was the difference between knowing where you were and being catastrophically wrong about where you were. She could not triangulate. Every fix she attempted collapsed when the 3rd reference star refused to agree with the first 2. She tried again, different stars, different baseline. The second attempt took 35 minutes and produced a position fix that placed the Sovereign Reach inside a solid planetary body, which was clearly incorrect. 120433. Navigator, Commander Vinokaris said, and it was a question with no question mark. The distortion is too severe for conventional optical fixes, Yeveth said. The gravitational lensing displaces stellar positions by up to 3 degrees across the observable field. My triangulations are producing impossible results. Is there another method? I am considering one. She did not elaborate, because the method she was considering was not in any Velthari manual, and she was not certain it would work, and the commander deserved honesty about what she knew, not speculation about what she hoped. She closed her eyes. The countdown clock was audible, a soft tick every second that the engineering team had probably intended as informational, and that was functioning as a metronome of dread. She did not ask them to turn it off. The crew needed the number. Pretending the number did not exist would not make the air last longer. The problem was not that she could not see stars. She could see them. The problem was that gravitational lensing bent their apparent positions, and without knowing the exact gravitational topology of the space around them, she could not correct for the bending. It was a circular problem. She needed to know where the gravity pockets were to fix the star positions, and she needed the star positions to determine where the gravity pockets were. unless she could find something that the gravity could not bend in a way that mattered, or rather, something whose bending she could calculate independently. 11:48:16. "Denath," she said, "what frequencies are you receiving?" The signals officer looked up from his station. "Standard background, subspace noise from the shoal's gravitational activity, nothing useful." "Not subspace, electromagnetic old spectrum radio frequencies." Denath's expression shifted the Vilthari equivalent of a raised eyebrow, which involved a slight narrowing of the secondary eyelids and a tilt of the cranial ridge. "Radio frequencies are pre-contact technology, Navigator. Nobody uses radio in this sector. The shoals generate electromagnetic noise from the gravitational compression of interstellar medium. Some of that noise will have consistent emission points, natural radio sources, pulsars, hydrogen clouds, compressed gas formations. If I can identify 3 or more discrete sources, I can triangulate against them regardless of optical gravitational lensing, because radio waves from a fixed source arrive with consistent phase relationships that I can use to calculate the angular displacement independently. That is a technique I have not seen in any current manual. It predates the current manuals by approximately 200 years. It was used by early deep space navigators before subspace positioning existed. I studied it in my thesis at the academy." She paused. "My thesis advisor called it charmingly obsolete. I am now finding it less charming and more necessary." 11:31:04. Denath reconfigured the communications array. It took 7 minutes, because the array was designed for subspace and electromagnetic reception, was technically a diagnostic mode that required bypassing 3 safety interlocks. And because Denath was the kind of officer who did things correctly the first time, which took slightly longer than doing them hastily and then correcting mistakes. The first sweep produced a wall of noise. The Kesrin shoals were electromagnetically loud compressed gas, ionized dust, thermal radiation from the gravity pockets themselves. Yeveth stared at the spectrum analyzer and began the slow, patient work of separating signal from noise. She filtered by emission pattern, looking for consistency, a source that repeated, that held a steady frequency, that behaved like a point rather than a cloud. She found the first natural radio source in 11 minutes, a consistent emission at 1.4 gigahertz, probably hydrogen radiation from a compressed gas cloud. She logged its bearing and began looking for the second. The second source took 23 minutes and turned out to be a pulsar, which was better than a gas cloud because pulsars had precise, predictable emission characteristics that she could cross-reference against the Vilthari pulsar catalog to determine which pulsar it was, and therefore how far away it was. She identified it as KSP 4471, a known source in the outer shoals. Its bearing gave her a second line. 11:02:41. "I have a partial fix," she told the bridge. 2 sources, I need a third for triangulation." She went back to the spectrum analyzer. The noise was dense. Every frequency was crowded with the shoal's own electromagnetic signature, and finding a discrete source inside that noise was like hearing a single voice in a stadium of shouting. She adjusted the bandpass filters. She narrowed the sweep width. She checked each candidate's spike against the noise floor and dismissed them one by one, too broad, too variable, too consistent with background compression noise. 10:47:19. The bridge was getting cold. The temperature had dropped another degree, and several officers had pulled the thermal liners from their station kits and draped them over their shoulders. The air had the faint metallic taste that came from recyclers working at reduced capacity, scrubbing carbon dioxide but losing the battle against the buildup of trace gases that the primary filters would normally handle. Yeveth's fingers were stiff on the console. She flexed them and continued searching. 10:32:55. "Navigator, If the third source is not available, Commander Vinokaris began. I know. Two sources gave her a line, not a point. She could determine that the sovereign reach was somewhere along a particular bearing from those two sources, but she could not determine where along that bearing. Without a third reference, the fix was incomplete, and an incomplete fix in the shoals was worse than no fix at all, because it could lead her to attempt a course through a region she only thought she understood. She kept searching. 1847. There a signal at 2.8 gigahertz. Faint. Steady. Not a natural emission signature. Too clean, too narrowband. It had the characteristics of an artificial transmission, a deliberately generated signal with a structured modulation pattern that no natural phenomenon produced. Deneth, I have something at 2.8 gigahertz bearing 173. Can you clean it up? The signals officer bent over his console. His fingers moved quickly, isolating the frequency, applying noise cancellation, boosting the gain on the directional receiver. 10 seconds later, confirmed, artificial signal, very low power. I am reading it at approximately 40 milliwatts effective radiated power at source. It is broadcasting a repeating pattern. What kind of pattern? Stand by. A pause. Deneth ran the pattern through the communications archive, searching for a protocol match. Then his cranial ridge went flat, the Velthari expression of profound confusion. Navigator, this is a navigational beacon. Standard format, repeating positional data on a fixed cycle, but the encoding protocol is. I do not recognize the protocol. It is not in our current communications standards database. Expand the search, historical protocols. Another pause. Found it. The signal carrier wave and encoding format are consistent with pre-compact era human communications technology. Specifically, Terran Deep Range Survey Protocol, standard circa human calendar year 2200. Estimated age of the protocol specification, at minimum 600 years. The bridge went very quiet. Yeveth heard the countdown clock ticking. She heard the hum of the air recyclers. She heard nothing else, because 13 officers had simultaneously stopped whatever they were doing and were staring at Deneth's console. There is no human installation in the Kesrin Shoals, Commander Vinokaris said. It was not a statement of disbelief. It was a statement of navigational fact. The Kesrin Shoals were Velthari territory, surveyed by Velthari ships, charted by Velthari navigators. Humans had never operated in this region. Humans had no reason to be in this region. The Velthari Admiralty's territorial survey records went back 300 years, and in all that time, no human presence had been documented in the shoals. The signal is there, Yeveth said. Whatever it is at a fixed point. It is artificial, and it is broadcasting positional data. I can use it as my third reference source. She entered the bearing into her working fix. 2 natural sources and 1 artificial. 3 bearings. She ran the triangulation, correcting for the gravitational displacement using the phase relationship method she had described to Deneth. The result placed the sovereign reach at a point inside the shoals that matched, to within 2 light seconds, the gravitational topology readings they had recorded before the array died. The fix was good. It was accurate. It was the best manual fix she had ever produced, and she had produced it using a 200-year-old technique, a pulsar, a gas cloud, and a signal from something that should not exist. I have our position, she said. 0958-11. The fix changed everything and changed nothing. She knew where they were. She could plot a course out of the shoals. But the course required precise navigation through the gravitational terrain, threading between gravity pockets, compensating for tidal gradients, maintaining a trajectory that kept the ship in navigable space, while the air slowly thinned and the temperature slowly dropped. On a full navigational array, it was a demanding but routine procedure that would take approximately 7 hours. by hand with manual fixes that needed to be recalculated every 40 minutes as the ship moved, and the apparent positions of her reference sources shifted. It was a 14-hour task. They had less than 10 hours of air. "I can get us out," she told the commander, "but not on the standard route. The standard route through the shoals follows the widest gravitational corridors, the safest path. It would take 14 hours of manual navigation. We don't have 14 hours. The alternative: narrow corridors. The Deep Chart expedition 31 years ago surveyed secondary passages through the shoals corridors between gravity pockets that are navigable but tight. One of them, designated Ks 7741, runs approximately in the direction we need to go and would cut transit time to roughly 6 hours. And the navigational hazards? Considerable. The corridors were surveyed 31 years ago. The gravity pockets migrate. A passage that was navigable then may have narrowed or closed entirely. If I fly us into a dead end, I will not have enough time to back out and find a different route. You are proposing to navigate a potentially closed corridor, by hand, using 600-year-old technology, in a gravity field that has already destroyed our navigational array. Yes, Commander. 094133. Commander Vinokaris looked at the countdown clock. He looked at Yeveth. He looked at the frozen navigational snapshot on her console, with the gravity pockets marked in the Admiralty's funeral gray. Then he nodded once, the way a man nods when the decision is not between a good option and a bad option, but between a bad option and a worse one. "Navigate us out, navigator." She began plotting. 091420. The first 3 hours were the worst. Not because the navigation was most difficult then, it was difficult throughout, but because the ship was still warm enough to feel the cold creeping in, the air was still breathable enough to notice the metallic edge growing sharper, and the crew had not yet crossed the threshold where hope becomes the only thing left, and therefore becomes stronger rather than weaker. In those first hours they were afraid. Fear was reasonable. Fear was appropriate. Yeveth felt it in her own chest, a cold weight behind the sternum that pulsed in time with the countdown clock. She worked through it. She had always worked through it. The Academy taught that fear was a chemical event, not a navigational variable, and that a navigator's hands did not shake because shaking hands produced inaccurate measurements. Her thesis advisor, Professor Catherine, had said it differently. "Yeveth, the universe does not care about your feelings. It only cares about your math." Her hands did not shake. Her math was good. The narrow corridor she chose was designated Ks 7741 on the Admiralty charts, a passage between two major gravity pockets that the Deep Chart expedition had rated navigable with caution. Recommend array-assisted transit only. The notation was underlined in red on the printed chart, which in Admiralty formatting meant, "We surveyed this and we don't recommend it, but if you're going to do it anyway, here's the data." The corridor was 11 light-minutes long and averaged 200,000 kilometers wide, which sounded generous until you considered that the gravity pockets flanking it could reach out with tidal fingers that narrowed the safe passage to as little as 30,000 kilometers. And that the sovereign reach needed to maintain a velocity high enough to transit the corridor before the air ran out, but low enough that Yeveth could correct course when the gravitational terrain surprised her. It would surprise her. The shoals always surprised navigators. That was why they killed one ship every 4 years. 084406. Lieutenant Orves at the helm was a quiet man with steady hands and the kind of professional patience that came from years of executing precise maneuvers on voice commands alone. He did not ask Yeveth to explain her calculations. He did not question her corrections. When she said 2 degrees port, 15% thrust for 6 seconds, he executed it exactly. And when the ship groaned under the tidal stress, he held the course without flinching. The first near miss came 40 minutes into the corridor. 08-14-09. A gravity pocket on the port side charted, expected, accounted for in Yevith's calculations, turned out to be larger than the 31-year-old survey data indicated. Its tidal reach extended 19,000 kilometers further into the corridor than the chart showed, and the Sovereign Reach's port hull crossed that invisible boundary at a relative velocity of 400 meters per second. The effect was immediate. The ship lurched port as the differential gravity caught the hull like a current catching a swimmer. Structural integrity monitors flashed yellow on 3 hull sections. 2 officers who had been standing at the damage control station went down, one hard enough that Yevith heard the impact of skull on deck plating. Correction, 10 degrees starboard, thrusters at 30% now. Orves fired the thrusters. The ship fought. For 14 seconds the Sovereign Reach hung in a gravitational tug-of-war, the maneuvering thrusters straining against the invisible hand of warped space-time, and the hull groaning with a sound that resonated through the deck and into Yevith's boots. Then the thrusters won and the ship slid back into the center of the corridor. Hull sections 9, 12, and 14 report stress fractures, reported the damage control officer, pressing a compress to the gash on Junior Lieutenant Revik's scalp. No breach. No atmospheric loss. Revik has a scalp laceration conscious, coherent. Medical to the bridge, Commander Vinakaris said. Then to Yevith, how far off was the chart? 19,000 kilometers. The gravity pocket has expanded since the last survey. I am updating my model. She updated. She redrew the corridor's safe boundaries on her chart with a grease pencil, narrowing the passage by the amount the gravity pocket had grown. The corridor was tighter than the chart showed. The margins were thinner. She continued. 07-55-40. Deneth, I need a bearing update on the 2.8 GHz source. Bearing 161 now, signal strength increasing. We are getting closer to it. Noticeably. Power at source appears constant, but our received signal strength has doubled in the last hour. The source is near the far end of corridor Ks 7741, approximately where the passage opens into the Kesren transition zone. Yevith recalculated. Whatever the artificial beacon was, and she had been trying not to think about what it might be, because thinking about mysteries was not as useful as navigating through gravitational hazards, it was positioned near their destination, near the exit. 07-22-18. The second near miss was worse. A tidal finger, an extension of the starboard gravity pocket that was not on any chart, reached across the corridor and caught the Sovereign Reach in a lateral shear that slammed the ship sideways at 40 meters per second. The deck tilted. Unsecured equipment, a medical kit, 2 thermal liners, the hard-copy chart binder that Yevith had left on the console shelf slid across the bridge. 3 more officers went down. The structural integrity monitor lit up amber on 6 hull sections simultaneously. All stop, full lateral correction port side, everything you have. Orves fired every port side thruster the ship had. The Sovereign Reach shuddered. The tidal finger was stronger than the first incident. The ship was deeper in the corridor now, where the gravity pockets were closer together and their tidal reach overlapped. For 11 seconds, the ship did not move. The thrusters held it in place against the shear, burning through emergency fuel reserves that they could not afford to spend. Then Chief Engineer Alves, who had been listening on the internal comm, and who understood thrust-to-mass ratios better than anyone else aboard, did something Yevith had not asked for. He brought the main drive online for exactly 2 seconds, fired a single burst of thrust into the port lateral vector, and shut it down again before the drive could interact with the navigational void and push them somewhere worse. The ship moved, the tidal finger released, the Sovereign Reach slid back into navigable space. Alves, Commander Vinakaris said on the internal comm, and his voice was the closest thing to warm that Yevith had ever heard from him. That was not authorized. No, Commander. Do it again if necessary. Understood, Commander. 064851. The temperature on the bridge had dropped 7 degrees since the cascade. The thermal liners were no longer optional. Yeveth's breath was visible in the emergency lighting, faint wisps that caught the amber glow and dissipated. Her fingers were stiff. She flexed them between observations, pressing them against the deck plating to keep circulation going, because a navigator with numb hands was a navigator who misreads star charts. The air was worse. The metallic taste had become a constant presence, and the recyclers were cycling with a labored rhythm that suggested their filters were approaching saturation. Chief Medical Officer Tresson reported from the medical bay that 3 crew members in the lower decks had reported headaches and mild dizziness, early symptoms of elevated carbon dioxide. Yeveth filed the information. It changed nothing about the navigation. It changed the timeline. She took her 14th manual stellar fix. The procedure was becoming mechanical optical sighting, bearing measurement, catalog cross-reference, gravitational correction using the 3-source triangulation, position update, course adjustment. Each cycle took 32 minutes. Each cycle kept them alive for the next 32 minutes. In between, she watched the corridor and listened to the ship. 061133. Coordinator. The voice came from the internal comms senior crew chief Marvin, responsible for the 170 enlisted crew in the lower decks. How long? Approximately 5.5 hours to corridor exit, Yeveth said. At current atmospheric reserve consumption, we have 6 hours and 11 minutes. 40 minutes of margin. Yes. I can reduce the lower deck population's oxygen consumption by putting non-essential personnel in rest bunkdom. Reduced metabolism, reduced breathing rate. It might buy us another 30 to 45 minutes. Do it. 0530-07. Yeveth was recalculating her 16th fix when the 2.8 GHz signal changed. She did not notice immediately. Her attention was on the pulsar bearing, which had shifted more than expected, suggesting that the gravity pocket on the port side was even larger than her revised model predicted. The shoals were alive, constantly shifting, the gravity pockets breathing and stretching like enormous invisible organisms. Navigating through them was like threading a needle that was also slowly rotating. But Deneth noticed. Navigator, the artificial signal has changed its transmission pattern. It was broadcasting navigational positional data on a fixed cycle. It has shifted to a different format. What format? Deneth's secondary eyelids retracted fully, the Vilthari equivalent of wide-eyed alarm. Navigator, the signal is now broadcasting a distress response acknowledgement. Standard interspecies emergency format, or rather, the historical precursor to the current format. It is acknowledging a distress call. We did not send a distress signal on that frequency. We did not send a distress signal on any frequency below subspace, but we are broadcasting continuously on subspace emergency channels, and our subspace signal is being degraded by the shoal's gravitational field. I have confirmed that fragments of our subspace transmission are leaking into the electromagnetic spectrum as the signal breaks down during propagation. The source, whatever it is, appears to have detected those electromagnetic fragments and interpreted them as a distress call. Yeveth stared at the spectrum analyzer. The acknowledgement pattern was clean, structured, and very old. It was using a communications protocol that predated the modern interspecies emergency framework by centuries. It was the protocol humans had used before subspace communication existed, before the Vilthari had even made contact with humans, before the interspecies communication compact had established the shared standards that every spacefaring species now used. Something 600 years old had heard their distress signal leaking into frequencies no one had used in centuries, had recognized it as a call for help, and had answered. Denath is the source moving. Negative, fixed position. Bearing 154, range approximately 8 light minutes. Stationary. A relay station. Possibly. The signal characteristics suggest a vessel or station with a pre-compact fusion reactor power plant. The emission signature includes a steady thermal background consistent with an operating reactor. Whoever or whatever it is powered and active. 05-1142. Commander Vinakaras stood from the command chair for the first time in 9 hours. He crossed to the communications station and looked at the signal data with the expression of a man who had spent 41 years in the Velthari Admiralty and had believed he understood the contents of his own sector. "There is no human vessel or installation in the Kesrin Shoals," he said again, and this time it was quieter, less certain. "Our territorial surveys have covered this region for 300 years. Our territorial surveys use subspace sensors," Yeveth said. "This station operates on electromagnetic frequencies. It would be invisible to every survey we have ever conducted. It has been here the entire time, and we did not know because we were not listening on the frequencies it uses." "Can we communicate with it?" "If Denath can transmit on the same protocol, we can try." 05-0419. Denath was an excellent signals officer. He rebuilt the communications array's electromagnetic transmission capability in 14 minutes, reverse engineering the ancient protocol from the beacon's own signal pattern. It was not a procedure that existed in any Velthari manual. It was improvisation, performed at a signals console that was never designed for it, under emergency lighting, with the air growing thin and the countdown clock ticking behind him, and a junior lieutenant bleeding into a compressed 2 meters away. At 04-48-33, he transmitted the first message, a standard distress declaration, formatted in the pre-compact protocol, identifying the Sovereign Reach as a vessel in navigational distress requesting assistance. The reply came in 7 seconds. It was text only, because the pre-compact protocol did not support voice transmission at this power level. The text appeared on Denath's console in characters that the translation system had to reach deep into its archive to render Old Human Standard English, a language variant that had not been in common use for 5 centuries. Terran Deep Range Monitoring Station KESSREN-7, Commission 2231 CE, Automated Watch Status, Distress Acknowledged, Transmit Vessel Position and Nature of Emergency. 2231 CE. Yeveth ran the conversion in her head. That was 612 years ago in the human calendar. 612 years, and the station was still listening, still responding, still performing its automated function with the quiet persistence of a machine that had never received an order to stop. She dictated the reply through Denath. Their position, the navigational failure, the atmospheric timeline, the corridor they were transiting, the number of crew aboard. She included everything. Whatever was out there, it already knew they were in trouble. There was no tactical reason to withhold. The response took 21 seconds. Longer than a simple relay, something was processing the information, comparing it against stored data, generating a response. KESSREN-7 acknowledges. Your position places you in corridor Ks 7741 VAELTHARI designation. This station maintains current gravitational survey data for all navigable corridors in the KESSREN shoals. Last survey cycle completed 47 standard days ago, transmitting navigational overlay for corridor Ks 7741. 0440-01. Yeveth watched the data stream arrive on the communications console. It took 90 seconds to complete transmission, a gravitational topology map of corridor Ks 7741, the same corridor she was navigating by hand with 31-year-old charts and a grease pencil. This map was 47 days old. It showed every gravity pocket, every tidal finger, every compression zone, every Class 1 through Class 5 tidal gradient in the passage, with an accuracy that made her 31-year-old Admiralty charts look like a child's sketch. The tidal finger that had nearly killed them 2 hours ago was on the map, clearly marked, annotated with its reach, its strength, its growth rate over the previous decade, and the safe transit envelope around it. If she had had this data 2 hours ago, she would have steered around it without incident. The expanded portside gravity pocket that had caused their first near miss was also on the map, marked with its actual boundaries, not the 31-year-old estimate on the Admiralty chart. The difference was exactly 19,000 kilometers, exactly the distance by which her calculations had been wrong. "Denath," she said, and her voice had changed. She could hear it herself, a crack in the steady calm where something else was leaking through, something she had not felt since the array died. "Ask the station how it has current survey data for a corridor in Vilthari, sovereign territory." The reply: "This station conducts continuous gravitational monitoring of all navigable passages in the KESSREN shoals. Survey cycle, 47 standard days. Monitoring method, distributed sensor network with 14 autonomous gravimetric BUOIS. Original mandate, ensure safe navigation for Terran deep range survey vessels operating in the KESSREN region. No Terran survey vessels have transited this region in 574 years. Monitoring continues per standing orders. No countermanding order received. 574 years. No human ship had come through in 574 years, and the station was still surveying, still deploying its gravimetric buoys, still mapping the shoals every 47 days, updating its charts, maintaining its sensor network, performing the job it was built to do for a fleet that had moved on half a millennium ago and forgotten this place existed. Standing orders. The machine was following standing orders from an authority that had dissolved before the Vilthari Admiralty was founded, and it was doing the job more thoroughly, more accurately, and more reliably than anyone had done it since. 04-2917. The navigational overlay changed everything. With the station's data, Yeveth could see the corridor as it actually was, not as it had been 31 years ago, but as it was right now, this month, this passage. She could see exactly where the gravity pockets had migrated, where the tidal fingers reached, where the safe passage narrowed to 30,000 kilometers, and where it widened to 400,000. She could see features that had not existed 31 years ago, new tidal gradients, compression zones that had formed since the last Admiralty survey, a secondary corridor branch that the old charts did not show. She plotted the rest of their course in 9 minutes. On the old charts, it would have taken her 4 hours of incremental fixes and corrections. The station's data turned the Kesrin Shoals from an adversary into a map dangerous, yes, but knowable, navigable, survivable. "Course updated," she told Lieutenant Orves. "New heading 347. Maneuvering thrusters at 20% continuous. The corridor opens in approximately 3.5 hours. 3.5 hours is inside our atmospheric margin," Commander Vinokaris said. "Yes, Commander. We will exit the shoals with approximately 2.5 hours of reserve." The bridge exhaled. Not literally, the air recyclers were working too hard for anyone to waste breath on size, but the tension that had held every officer rigid at their stations for 10 hours loosened by a fraction. 2.5 hours of margin was not comfortable, but it was a number that meant survival rather than arithmetic that ended in 0. 03-4450. Navigator, the station is transmitting again. KESSREN-7 to distress vessel. Your current course is optimal for atmospheric reserve constraints. Advisory. At your current velocity, you will encounter a Class 3 tidal gradient AT corridor position 7741 echo in approximately 94 minutes. Recommend velocity reduction to 60% beginning AT grid reference echo 4 and maintaining through echo 9. Gravitational data for echo positions attached. Additional advisory. Class 2 lateral shear AT grid reference Foxtrot 7 requires 8-degree heading adjustment to starboard. Data attached. The station was not just providing a chart. It was actively monitoring their course, comparing their trajectory against its 47-day-old survey data, and generating real-time advisories for hazards they had not yet reached. It was doing the job of a navigational array, the job their dead array could no longer do. Yeveth opened the attachments. The Class 3 gradient at echo was a feature that did not appear on any Velthari chart new, probably no more than a decade old. A gentle but persistent curvature in the space-time fabric that would push the Sovereign Reach off course by 4,000 kilometers if she did not account for it. The lateral shear at Foxtrot 7 was another uncharged hazard, subtle enough that she might not have detected it on instruments until it was pulling the ship sideways. On the old charts, she would have hit both blind. She corrected her course preemptively. Deneth, transmit the following. Sovereign Reach acknowledges advisories. Course corrected for echo and Foxtrot hazards. This vessel and crew owe a debt to Kesrin 7 and its builders. The reply. Acknowledged. This station was built to keep VESSELS safe in the KESSREN shoals. No debt is owed for the performance of standing duty. 03-1833. Commander Vinokaris read the message on the command display. He was silent for a long time. The kind of silence that happens when a man who has understood the universe in a particular way for 41 years encounters a fact that does not fit. They built this 600 years ago, he said, for their own survey ships. Their survey ship stopped coming 574 years ago, and the station is still performing its standing duty. Yes, Commander. We did not ask for this. We did not know it was here. Our distress signal was not aimed at any human system. It was a Velthari subspace emergency signal, directed at the Velthari Admiralty. This station heard it because fragments of our signal leaked into frequencies we were not even transmitting on deliberately. Yes, Commander. And the station's response to hearing a signal from a species it was never built to serve, on a frequency it was never designed to monitor, in a sector where its builders have not operated in nearly 6 centuries, was to provide us with the most comprehensive navigational data this region has ever seen. Yes, Commander. Vinokaris returned to his command chair. He sat. He looked at the countdown clock. They built something that would help anyone who came through here, he said. Not just their own people, anyone, and they built it to last. 02-5244. The next hours were precise, methodical, and almost calm. The station continued transmitting advisories, 7 more over the course of the transit, each one flagging a hazard that Yeveth would not have detected until she was in it. A Class 2 compression zone at grid reference Gulf 3 that required a brief altitude change. A narrow region at Hotel 1 where 2 gravity pockets had migrated toward each other, squeezing the corridor to 18,000 kilometers. A thermal gradient at India 6 that would confuse the ship's external temperature sensors and produce a false breach alarm. Each time, the station's advisory arrived minutes before Yeveth would have encountered the hazard. Each time, the data was precise, current, and delivered without commentary or judgment, the mechanical patience of a system that had been doing this job for longer than most civilizations kept records. The Class 3 gradient at position echo was exactly where the station said it would be. She reduced velocity to 60% at echo 4 and felt the reach ease through the curvature like a ship taking a wave at the right angle, not comfortable, but controlled. The hull groaned but held. The structural monitors stayed green. The narrow squeeze at Hotel 1 was the tightest point. 18,000 kilometers of navigable space, with the Sovereign Reach's hull occupying 400 meters of it. The math said they fit. The math did not account for the psychological effect of watching the gravitational topology display show the safe corridor as a sliver of green between two walls of red, with the ship as a dot in the middle. 3 bridge officers closed their eyes as they passed through. Yeveth did not. Her eyes were on the chart, on the bearing indicators, on the position fix. She did not have the luxury of fear at that moment. Fear would come later. 020714. The corridor widened. The gravitational terrain smoothed. The tidal stresses on the hull dropped from yellow margin to green, and then to the flat, featureless readings that meant open space. The compressed gas glow of the shoals was behind them, replaced by the clean, undistorted starfield of the Kesrin transition zone. Navigator. We are clear of the Kesrin shoals, Commander. The corridor exit is behind us. We are in navigable space. The bridge was silent for 5 seconds. Then someone in the back, Junior Lieutenant Revek, still bleeding through the compress on his scalp, still at his station where he had refused to be relieved, exhaled a sound that was not a cheer, not a sob, not a prayer, but something that contained all three, and the sound broke the silence open, and the bridge crew breathed for what felt like the first time in 12 hours. 020140. They had 2 hours of air remaining. The nearest Velthari outpost was 6 hours away at standard speed, but they were in open space now, and their subspace communications were no longer degraded by the shoals. Denath transmitted a Priority 1 distress call to the Admiralty on standard frequencies, and the acknowledgement came in 11 minutes. A patrol group was already conducting exercises in the adjacent sector and was diverting to their position. Estimated arrival 90 minutes. They would make it, the math worked, the air would hold. 014409. Denath, one more message to Kesrin 7. Go ahead, Navigator. She dictated carefully because she wanted the words to be right, and because the pre-compact protocol was not designed for elegance, and the translation might lose nuances. This is Navigator First Class Yeveth Sonadrel of the Velthari Heavy Cruiser Sovereign Reach. Your station's navigational data saved this vessel, 14 officers and 170 crew. Your 600-year gravitational survey of the Kesrin Shoals is the most accurate and comprehensive navigational resource this sector has ever possessed. I intend to report your existence and your data to the Velthari Admiralty, with a recommendation for formal recognition and integration into our navigational infrastructure. You have performed your standing duty beyond any reasonable measure. On behalf of this crew, thank you. End message. The reply came in 9 seconds. KESSREN-7 acknowledges. This station will continue monitoring the KESSREN shoals per standing orders. Safe transit to your destination. KESSREN-7 out. Yeveth read the message twice. Then she looked at Commander Vinakaris, who was reading it on the command display. They did not build it for us, she said. No. They built it for themselves, 600 years ago, for their own survey fleet. And then they moved on and the survey fleet stopped coming and the station kept doing the job. And when our distress signal leaked onto a frequency it was never designed to receive, it did not check whether we were human. It did not check whether we were authorized. It heard a ship in trouble and it gave us everything it had. The humans wrote their orders broadly. The humans wrote their orders like they expected the universe to be full of people who might need help navigating a dangerous passage. Like it did not occur to them to specify that the help should only be given to their own kind. 010422. The Velthari patrol group arrived 86 minutes after the distress call. 2 frigates and a fleet tender, carrying spare atmospheric reserves, a mobile engineering team, and the coupling relays that would restore the Sovereign Reach's navigational array. They docked. They replenished the air. They began repairs. Junior Lieutenant Revek was finally allowed to go to the medical bay, where he submitted to treatment with the vaguely offended air of a man who considered a scalp wound insufficient reason to leave his post. The senior officer of the patrol group, Captain Salvin, came aboard the Sovereign Reach and received Commander Vinokaris's report in the wardroom. Yeveth was present because the navigation was her story and her report, and because she had already begun drafting the formal recommendation and was not willing to let anyone else characterize what Kesrin 7 had done. A pre-compact human monitoring station, Captain Salvin said, turning the data tablet with the station's transmissions in her hands. Operating continuously for 6 centuries in Velthari sovereign territory, conducting gravitational surveys, maintaining a sensor network, broadcasting navigational advisories to anyone who happens to be listening on a frequency that no one has listened on since before the compact was signed. That is correct, Yeveth said. And this station detected your distress signal by accident. You were not attempting to contact any human system. We were not. Our distress call was on Velthari subspace emergency channels, directed at the Admiralty. Fragments of the signal leaked into the electromagnetic spectrum due to propagation degradation in the shoals. The station's sensors detected those fragments. Its automated systems identified them as a distress pattern and responded on a protocol 6 centuries old. Captain Salvin set the tablet down. This data, the 47-day gravitational survey cycle, is more current and more accurate than anything the Admiralty's Survey Division has produced for the Kesrin Shoals in 30 years. In 300 years, Yeveth corrected. The station has been surveying continuously since 2231 CE. Its archive contains the complete gravitational history of the shoals over that period. Every migration, every compression event, every corridor change for 600 years. The Admiralty has nothing comparable. No one does. 000000. The countdown clock reached 0, while the fleet tender was still pumping atmosphere into the Sovereign Reach's reserves. By then, it did not matter. The air from the tender was already circulating, fresh and warm and clean, and the crew was breathing in great relieved lungfuls, and the bridge officers were peeling off their thermal liners, and someone had found a working heating coil and was making the acrid Velthari service tea that tasted like engine coolant, and that no one had ever been more grateful to drink. The only person who noticed the clock hit 0 was Yeveth, who was still sitting at the navigation console, transcribing the station's data into the Admiralty's chart format, because the data was too important to leave on a signals console, and because if she stopped working she was going to have to feel everything she had not permitted herself to feel for the last 14 hours, and she was not yet ready for that. She filed her report that evening from the fleet tender's communications suite. It was 11 pages long, written in the dry procedural language that the Admiralty expected from its navigators. She described the cascade failure, the failed stellar fixes, the radio frequency triangulation, the discovery of Kesrin 7, the navigational overlay, the 9 hazard advisories, the transit of Corridor Ks 7741, and the successful exit from the shoals. In the final section, under recommendations, she wrote, Terran Deep Range Monitoring Station Kesrin 7 should be entered into the Velthari Admiralty Navigational Registry as an active navigational aid. Its 600-year data archive should be downloaded in full and integrated into the Admiralty's gravitational survey of the Kesrin Shoals. The station itself should be physically located, inspected, and provided with replacement components sufficient to extend its operational life. Contact should be established with the relevant Terran authority to acknowledge this station's service and to coordinate its continued operation. This vessel and its crew of 184 are alive because a machine built by a different species, for a different era, with no instruction to assist Velthari ships, heard our signal on a frequency we did not know we were transmitting on, and answered with the most comprehensive navigational data this sector has ever produced. The station's response, when thanked, was that no debt is owed for the performance of standing duty. The Admiralty would do well to match that standard. She submitted the report. She closed the console. She sat in the quiet of the fleet tender's communications room and felt her hands begin to shake, 14 hours after they should have, and she let them. Somewhere in the Kesrin Shoals, a machine 612 years old continued to monitor the gravitational terrain, update its charts, deploy its sensor buoys, and listen for vessels in distress on frequencies that no one had used in centuries. Its builders had moved on half a millennium ago. Its standing orders had not.